Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining our Building Bridges conference today. Welcome to the second panel of Day 3, which we have titled Modernity, Higher Education and Epistemology. My name is Dani, and I'm a second-year PhD student at Nottingham Trent University, and I'll be introducing our speakers today. Our first presentation today is from Clarke. Lee is currently in his third year of a PhD at Nottingham Trent University. In 2020, he wrote an article comparing Buddhism and modern Western psychology for the Psychologist, titled, Our Life is Shaped by Our Mind. Lee comments that issues of postcolonialism feature prominently in his research. His talk today is titled, Wisdom Comes in Many Forms, Towards an Inclusive Conception of Philosophy. Our second speaker is Treesa Joseph. Annie is a PhD scholar at the Institute of English, University of Kerala. Her doctoral research is an interdisciplinary study on rituals of queenship in colonial India. Annie is interested in colonial historiography and its points of intersection with gender, sovereignty, mobility, and spatiality. Her paper today is titled Decolonial Modernity and Queenship Traditions in Bhopal, the curious case of Regency and Regnancy of Nawab, Sikander, Begum of Bhopal. Following this, we will hear a paper from Delso Batista. Delso is a Brazilian Portuguese PhD candidate in psychology and researcher at the Psychology Department at Nottingham Trent University. He has published a book of poetry, is a registered psychologist, and holds a master's degree in psychology, psychotherapy, and counseling. His talk today is titled Coloniality of Power and Racism Denial, Autoethnographic Reflections on the Portuguese Higher Education. And our final presentation today will come from Sujoy Banerjee. Sujoy is currently a first-year student in the MA Cafeteria program, pursuing a degree in English literature at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. His area of interest include, but are not limited to, nation and nationality, Marxism, suburban studies, Dalit literature, graphic novels, and digital humanities. His paper today is titled Language, Science, and Our Modernity, an argument for diversification of the language of science in a post-colonial world. Please note that today's event includes live automated captions, and this may include some mistakes. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Clarke, and this is my presentation for the Building Bridges conference. The presentation is called Wisdom Comes in Many Forms, Towards an Inclusive Conception of Philosophy. During the 20th century, European colonies in Asia and Africa began to gain independence from colonial rule. In the decades after this process of what became known as decolonization, the peoples of these states began to take control of their own narratives and speak from their own experiences of colonization and its effects. As well as this, they began to challenge the Eurocentric views of intellectual thought that claimed that only Europeans had made valuable contributions to civilization. An intellectual movement based on these ideas was soon established by the works of scholars such as Frantz Fanon and Edward Said, who wrote the seminal post-colonial text Orientalism, and the movement is today known as Postcolonialism. What Said's Orientalism did was to reveal the existence of Orientalism, which is an ideology that the European West used to classify the East and in the process to other it. The East, Western scholars have maintained, is simply different to the West. It is indeed the opposite, even the antithesis to the West. Whilst the West, according to this ideology, is the paradigm of reason, logic, progressiveness, democracy, and science, the East is backward, despotic, unchanging, irrational, and mystical. The East was therefore in need of help and civilization, and the West, in the form of European and later American power, saw it as their duty to assist them in this endeavour. Orientalism, in my view, has continued to the present day and has gone on to affect philosophy as well. It has continued to inform the lens through which the East and Eastern philosophy in particular is seen. Whilst Western philosophy is seen as being based firmly on reason, logic, and, due to the influence of the Enlightenment, as being separate from religion, Eastern philosophy is seen as the opposite to Western thought, the other. It is irrational, illogical, religious, mystical, backward, and it is even questioned by some whether Eastern philosophy deserves the name of philosophy at all. These opinions arose during the colonial period, when Westerners projected back into history their then current position of dominance, and thought that the West must have always been in some way inherently superior to the East, which accounted for the subjugation of one by the other. The so-called superiority also extended into the intellectual arena, including philosophy. These opinions then contribute to two main misconceptions about Eastern philosophy. Firstly is the idea that the East cannot even have philosophy because it is something solely Western in origin. The second is that, as stated above, Eastern traditions are too religious, mystical, and irrational to even constitute philosophy. Both assumptions are common and yet are incredibly problematic. For a start, whilst much, if not virtually all, of Western philosophy did indeed emerge from a classical Greece, with the word itself coming from the Greek word philosophia, meaning love of wisdom, philosophy in general is now acknowledged to have arisen in more places than just Greece. Many of the most well-known and important Greek philosophers were not even from mainland Greece itself, but were from the many Greek colonies dotted around the Mediterranean, and later on came from various parts of the Alexandrian and Roman empires. To pretend that Greeks and Romans would not have come into contact with the various diverse cultures that surrounded them in these places is implausible. Following from this, we can see that the origin of Western philosophy in Greece does not mean that other cultures and ideas did not have an influence on the Greeks, as the Greeks undoubtedly did on the other cultures that they came into contact with. Scholars have begun to see the influence of non-Greek ideas on Greek thought itself, and have questioned the idea that the West was always superior to the East in intellectual terms. These scholars include Brett W. Davis, who emphasizes Greece's intellectual influences from countries such as Egypt, Persia, and India. Thomas Machiavelli, who in his book The Shape of Ancient Thought, argues that Greek and Indian philosophy influenced each other throughout history, mainly in the wake of the Persian and Alexandrian conquests. These opinions go beyond philosophers, with experts in other fields also coming to the same conclusions. Anthropologist Jack Goody wrote of the spread of ideas around Eurasia in ancient times, suggested convergence rather than divergence between East and West, and he disputed the solely Western origin of such concepts as democracy, equality, and freedom, as well as academic fields such as the sciences. Historians such as Peter Frankopan, in his 2015 book The Silk Roads, have started to re-emphasize the importance of Eastern cultures to overall human civilization, and he speaks about the Silk Roads acting as arteries for the spread of faiths, ideas, and technology around Eurasia, as well as just pure trade. None of this is to deny the vital philosophical and wider intellectual contributions of Greece or wider Western culture generally. Pretending that the West has done nothing to contribute to the world would merely be repeating the same ignorance in the other direction. Rather, my aim is to make it clear that as important as Greek contributions to philosophy have been, they were not the only important contributions that were made. Despite the commonly held misconception that philosophy is purely a Western invention, recent scholarship is revealing something different. It is revealing that philosophy is the result of numerous ideas from numerous places coming together and influencing each other through various means. Diversity is how ideas are forged and spread, and it supports the idea that philosophy should be a field that represents the intellectual contributions of all of humanity, rather than just a single part of it. The second main idea that permeates Western views of Eastern philosophy is that it is not really philosophy as such because it is too bound up with religion. It is too much based on what is deemed to be mysticism and irrationality, whereas Western, in brackets, real philosophy is the opposite of this, being based purely on reason, logic, and is clearly demarcated from religion. Almost all of these ideas about both forms of philosophy are generalizations, which, whilst containing an element of truth in them, contain a much more complex and varied picture. Whilst there are Eastern schools of philosophy which involve mysticism and tend to be more in touch with religion than Western schools of thought, the situation is more complicated than this fact implies. Many Eastern schools of philosophy have employed reason and logic as much as any Western one. In India, for example, the Nyaya school of Hindu philosophy formulated sophisticated theories of logic and epistemology. Arguments from the Buddhist tradition were just as complex. Nagarjuna argued that everything was empty of inherent existence. Vasubandhu and the Yogacara school thought that everything was mental in nature. Dharmakirti come up with complex arguments against the existence of God, and the penetrating logic of Dignaga went on to influence Buddhist thought for millennia. Even outside of standardized schools, logic and rational argument were used. The philosopher Jayarasi Bhatta, a radical skeptic, in the one text of his that we have, proceeded to show the logical contradictions in every mainstream school of Indian thought across all religious traditions. We can see then that many forms of Eastern philosophy made as much use of reason and logic as did Western thinkers. Whilst it was to a large extent tied up with religion, this is no different to how during the Middle Ages, Western philosophers were almost exclusively adherents of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and used philosophy to defend their religious beliefs. This in no way makes the contributions of these thinkers any less valuable. Should we deny the status of philosopher to Thomas Aquinas, Maimonides, or Ibn Sina because of their very strongly held religious beliefs? If not, then why should we deny it for Eastern religious thinkers? There is also the fact that the line between religion and philosophy has never been as clear-cut in the East as it is in the modern West, and one could argue that the demarcation has only existed in the West since the Enlightenment. The idea that Western philosophy is based entirely on reason and logic without any mystical leanings at all is also a generalization. Whilst Western philosophy does indeed rely on these concepts, it is not true to think that Western philosophy has no mystical orientation to speak of. One of the Western philosophical schools that was arguably very mystical or religious in its orientation was Neoplatonism, expounded by Plotinus. Neoplatonism was hardly consistent with the stereotype of Western philosophy as being entirely based on reason and logic. Its adherents sought a mystical union of their souls with the divine Godhead known as the One. Indeed, it is more alike to Eastern religions and philosophies in some ways. What is the difference between the Neoplatonists' search for the spiritual union with the One and a Hindu search for union with Brahman, or a Taoist contemplation of the Tao? We would never cease to refer to Neoplatonism as Western philosophy, or to Plotinus himself as a Western thinker. Yet he clearly expounded a more Eastern-like philosophy based as it did on contemplation and union with the transcendent. Neoplatonism in particular is evidence that Western philosophy has not always been solely based on reason and logic, just as Eastern thought has not solely been based on mysticism and itself has a strong logical, rational tradition. What all of this shows is that the bifurcation between rational and logical Western philosophy and religious and mystical Eastern philosophy is much too simplistic and does no justice to what we know about both traditions. Therefore, one way to encourage a more inclusive conception of philosophy is to challenge these two misconceptions. Make sure the research on the non-Western origins of philosophy generally and cross-cultural influences between Greece and other places is as widely known as the Greek origins of Western philosophy. To address the second misconception, we need to introduce more Eastern and non-Western thinkers generally into the curriculum of Western philosophy departments and show people that their contributions to philosophy are as important, sophisticated, and as valued as any Western thinker. Another way towards a more inclusive view that could work alongside these is to inform people of the interconnections of ideas and cultures that have occurred throughout more recent intellectual history, which will then erode the view that philosophy should be divided by large metaphorical walls and should be seen as one single discipline. For example, one should know that during the Middle Ages, Socrates and Aristotle were as much respected and revered in Paris and Oxford as they were in Baghdad or Damascus, and that a Latin-speaking Christian and Arabic-speaking Muslim would have been familiar with the same ideas from the same thinkers, and thus would have been able to communicate within a shared intellectual and philosophical culture that crossed their respective faiths. This particular example raises the question of whether or not Islamic and Western philosophy should even be considered as different subdisciplines of the subject at all. The need for more inclusive conception of philosophy is a pressing one. With the geopolitical rise of countries such as India and China, it is increasingly necessary that we come to understand each other's systems of thought and other ways of seeing life and living in the world. In our modern world that is ever more interconnected, the fact that entire systems of thought are still excluded from the mainstream curriculum is now more untenable than ever. If philosophy wants to stay relevant as a discipline in the 21st century, these issues need to be addressed and dealt with, and we need to give non-Western philosophers an equal place at the table. We claim to be a subject for all of humanity, not just a single part of it. It is therefore time that we practiced what we preached and buried these outdated colonial notions in the ground where they belong. As philosophers, we should respond as Diogenes of Sinope did when asked where he came from. He replied, "I am a citizen of the world." Thank you very much.
Very good afternoon, one and all. My name is Annie Treesa Joseph. I'm a PhD scholar at Institute of English, University of Kerala. This paper, which is titled Decolonial Modernity and Queenship Traditions in Bhopal, the Curious Case of Regency and Regnancy of Nawab Sikander Begum of Bhopal, is an offshoot of my doctoral research on the study of select queens in colonial India. Now, let us look at the structure of the paper. There is an introduction to give you a little understanding about the princely state of Bhopal, which is followed by a description on the contest of Nawab Sikander Begum's ascent to Regency and Regnancy, followed by a discussion on decolonial facets of Begum's politics, which is followed by a conclusion. Introduction. Bhopal was one of the princely states in central India carved by Dost Muhammad Khan and thus ruled by Aurangzeb Pathan dynasty of Afghan origin. Dost and the subsequent rulers negotiated different treaty relationship with the British, thus becoming part of the subsidiary alliance system of indirect rule. In 1880, which guaranteed British support for Bhopal and its territories. Indirect rule constricted the state's internal autonomy, and a political agent or resident had to be reported about the state's daily affairs. One of the fascinating features of this state is that this state was ruled by 4 female sovereigns for 4 consecutive terms, that is from 1820 to 1926, for a period of 107 years. Nawab Sikander Begum, here abbreviated as NSB, was the second Begum of Bhopal who ruled as a regent from 1844 to 1860 and as a regnant Begum from 1860 to 68. Nawab Sikander Begum was the heir apparent for whom Qudsiya, the first Begum of Bhopal, was a regent. But the treaty negotiated with the British and the ulema stipulated that her husband would become the chief of state upon Sikander's marriage. This is a painting of Her Highness Sikander Begum of Bhopal. Now, let us look at the contest of Nawab Sikander Begum's ascent to Regency and Regnancy, thereby delineating the decolonial politics of presidents. Nawab Sikander Begum was a harbinger of colonial modernity by building roads, hospitals, schools, etc. She also set up a modern judicial system, police department, intelligence network, and constituted a nominated parliament. I contend that these steps in the direction of colonial modernity were her shrewd strategies to embark on a decolonial trajectory. Nawab Sikander Begum garnering British support. Nawab Sikander Begum was garnering British support to make her a force to reckon with. Over time, she accrued enough political milestones to bargain with the British and thus making her an essential colonial power shaping the colonial world. By 1854, Nawab Sikander Begum mounted a momentous campaign that set a significant precedent in the history of Bhopal. In this paper, I argued that creating presidents was the major decolonial tool unleashed by Nawab Sikander Begum of Bhopal. Begum's major political tool was citing and setting precedents. Precedence is a decolonial strategy that the Begum employed to shape the colonial world and be a molding influence on the colonial world. In the context of Queen Victoria's ascent to the English throne and having demonstrated to both the British and the people of Bhopal that Sikander Begum and her own mother are able rulers, thereby discrediting the view that Muslim women's rule is inferior, and having made Bhopal a model state recognized by successive governor generals, NSB, that Sikander Begum asked a crucial question. Why can't Bhopal have a female regnant ruler or sovereign? She had appealed to the British government for changing 2 seminal decisions they took in the past, which is pertaining to the secession in the princely state of Bhopal. She pointed out that infant girls whom the British recognized as titular rulers should hand over the reins of power to their husbands upon marriage is an unfair practice. I quote, unlike her own case, this condition should be expunged in the case of Shah Jahan, her doctor and the heir apparent, whose husband should not be given executive powers and act merely as a non-executive consort like Prince Albert. Unquote. Here, her effective employment of the political office of a male consort is fascinating. In the words of Shahryar Muhammad Khan, her great grandson, I quote, all along, Sikander artfully underlined her allegiance to Queen Victoria, implying that what was sauce for the English goose was sauce for the Bhopali gander. Now, let us look at Sikander Begum's involvement in the 1857 revolution. Sikander Begum was the Begum of Bhopal when the 1857 revolution, which is also known as the First War of Independence or the Sepoy Mutiny, broke out. Since the state was loyal to the British, mutineers camped in Bhopal and demanded the abdication of Begum. Along with the support of the Bhopali gentry for the rebellion, Sikander Begum also had to deal with the ulema who called for jihad against the British rule, urging people to respond to Emperor Bahadur Shah Sapal's call to free India from the British rule. Even Qudsiya, her mother, was against Sikander Begum's stand to support the British. Sikander's Begum not only pacified the rebelling mutineers by her shrewd strategy of appeasement, being a wise ruler who knew how to harness religion to her benefit, she declared that those who remain disloyal are enemies of Islam rule in Bhopal. By the strategic use of money and monarchy, Begum Sikander effectively quelled the rebellion in Bhopal. Now let us look at the contest of her ascent to Regnancy. Sikander Begum had ruled Bhopal imperiously for 16 years as a regent, acting on behalf of Shah Jahan, the titular ruler. With her loyalty proven, Sikander now mounted a campaign with the British to have herself recognized as formally as the Begum of Bhopal, citing precedents of Muslim women who had been prominent rulers like Hazrat Aisha and Queen Victoria, English queens like Queen Elizabeth and Queen Victoria. Sikander's demarche put the British in a dilemma because they could not be seen to renege on their own decision to appoint Shah Jahan as a titular ruler while Sikander acted as regent. On the other hand, Sikander had proved her loyalty in an extreme crisis and had governed Bhopal into a progressive and flourishing state. Sikander Begum effectively sided with treating with the British to her advantage and argued that, I quote, the chief power in the state cannot be inherited by the children of the chief, while the chief himself is alive. If the words, heirs and successors which repeatedly occurred in the treaty are to be allowed their full weight in Her Majesty's court, then that order which declared me to be the chief on the death of my father ought to be upheld for my lifetime. Unquote. The British, who was put in an ethical quandary, finally moved in favor of NSP. When the British was ready to bestow upon her lifetime regency, she demanded, I quote, if she could be given the authority, there were no grounds to deny her the title of the regnant monarch or titular ruler. Unquote. Sikander Begum's reasoning was flawless, and Shah Jahan agreed to abdicate in her favor on May 1st, 1860. I quote, Her Majesty's government recognized Sikander as the reigning Begum of Bhopal, Shah Jahan as the heir apparent, with Umrao Dowla, her non-executive consort. At last, 2 years after Queen Victoria became the Empress of India, the British government had formally recognized a Muslim woman's right to rule. Now let us look at the decolonial facets of the Queen's politics. By citing precedents, Sikander Begum created the precedence of female rule as a legitimate rule in colonialism. This is a significant epistemic dealing that she brought in her wake to place the British in an ethical dilemma that they cannot navigate it through to place the British in an ethical dilemma that they cannot navigate through legal terms is a feat won by few native princes or princesses. As a person who initiated this intractable predicament for the British, Sikander Begum deserves to be placed as a pioneer in setting precedents for women to rule in their own right in colonial India. Now, let us look at Sikander Begum's negotiations with the Muslim kingship practices. Act of diplomatically wresting power from the British and the conservative Muslim community also redefined Islamic kingship conceptions for two reasons. Muslim kingship practices are characterized by the supremacy of Islamic codes, in contrast to the theory of divine right, where the kingship is hereditary and the king is God's representative on earth. Quran describes kingship as, I quote, Allah bestows sovereignty on whom he pleases and takes away sovereignty from whom he pleases, unquote. Sikander, by demanding Regnancy, negotiated with both colonial and Islamic law and reinforced through her success that Allah can after all choose a female sovereign. Muslim monarchs, as mentioned earlier, should get religious sanction to be political head of an Islamic state. It was Allah and ulema in extension that legitimized their right to rule. The Aurangzeb dynasty to which these begums belonged were Sunni Muslims. Ulema is a vital religious institution from which the Sunni Muslim political authorities trace their authenticity and legitimacy. The Begums of Bhopal opened this Islamic convention and negotiated with colonial power to consolidate their power and ensure the safety of their kingdom and dynasty. Seeking colonial sanction can also be interpreted as a heresy, since it is Allah who bestows sovereignty on Muslim kings. The Begums' calculated and elusive negotiations helped them rule without attracting censure either from the ulema or from the British. The mutiny was represented as a Mohammedan conspiracy, since Bahadur Shah Sapar was a titular head of the armed rebellion. But many Muslim states like Hyderabad, Bhopal chose not to partake in the project to reinstall Mughal court to its former glory. Sikander Begum's loyalty to British was rewarded by making her the reigning monarch of a 19-consulate state, that is, upgrading her state from a 17-consulate state to a 19-consulate state, which meant so much in the colonial era, and was also given territories lost to the neighboring prince. She was also awarded the Grand Cross of the Star of India, making her at the time the only female knight in the British Empire besides Queen Victoria, a position that underlines her unique status as well as her close relationship with the British. This again made her a force to reckon with. But her betrayal of the Muslim and the Mughal cause had several internal consequences, for Bhopal was a Muslim state. Sikander, with the success that she garnered from the British side, set forth to recover her own prestige before the Muslim community that had been tarnished by her perceived loyalty to the British. I quote, she went to the famous Juma Masjid in Delhi that had been contemptuously converted by the British into a stable for their horses. She ordered the closure of the stables, paid large sums to renovate the famous mosque, and got down on her knees to scrub and purify the mosque herself. No one, not even the British, dared to challenge the Begum in her efforts, and she was able to regain her stature in the eyes of her Muslim brethren as a pious and courageous defender of the Muslim community, unquote. And she also became the first Muslim ruler from the emperor to the chieftain in the entire Indian subcontinent to undertake the arduous and dangerous pilgrimage to Mecca, thus steadfastly proclaiming her Muslim identity. So this queen can be seen revising the idea of kingship inscribed in the sacred text of Islam. Thus, Sikander Begum negotiated with native and foreign kingship traditions to normalize women in power. Now, let us look at regnancy and the dismantling of power sharing in a heterosexual setting. Finally, I quote, nationalist project construct women primarily through a heterosexual relationship to men that emphasizes a supposedly natural hierarchy between men and women, unquote. In the case of warrior queens, irrespective of being exceptional in their military skills, like Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, they believed in the conventional hierarchy of men over women. It is evident in their attempt to get the adopted male heir, who was mostly a child, installed as the king. They never acknowledged their inherent right to rule the kingdom as capable queens. But in the case of Begums of Bhopal, the line of succession passed from mother to daughter. These queens never defined themselves in relation to the males in their family, like the husband, father, or son for that matter. Instead, they managed to be autonomous individuals who flaunted their right to rule as female monarchs. When it comes to Begums of Bhopal, this 107-year rule of this female monarch has a fascinating uniqueness. Though they were appointed by the British as regent queens, the four Begums in succession inherited their right to rule from their mothers instead of regent queens elsewhere, who ruled on behalf of their sons or late husbands. NSB, Sikander Begum, pioneered in officiating the office of non-executive consort in Bhopal to efface the precedence of husband taking over as rulers. She also thus legally restricted the Queen's Council by effectively safeguarding autonomy of female sovereigns in the state. The second Begum of Bhopal seems to have defied the age-old custom and set a precedent for Indian women to be ambitious and aspire beyond the heterosexual setting that was set by the patriarchal machinations of the subcontinent. I would like to talk further about Sikander Begum's interactions and negotiation with Islam and its para-modern politics, but owing to time constraints, I'm limiting my presentation to this point. So over to the conclusion. Sikander Begum's primary tool in dealing with the British and dismantling the colonial matrix of power was to cite precedents and set precedents. I contend that besides the theoretical premise of decoloniality as epistemic dealing and dismantling of the colonial matrix of power, or divulging that coloniality still shapes the post-colonial world, I argue that decoloniality is also about a disclosure that coloniality was not the only force that shaped the colonial world. In an era where colonial knowledge production was effort, Sikander Begum understood the importance of creating precedents that went into official records of the British. This way, she facilitated epistemic reconstruction and left to the world to discover that coloniality was not the only power that shaped or continues to shape the colonial world. Individual assertions, buoyed up by shrewd statesmanship, forced the British to arbitrate with a female regent of a 17th consolate state and yield to her demand. Decolonial modernity, in that case, I argue that, was using the discursive strategies of colonial modernity to open the coloniality that pervaded the colonial world. This is a classic example of decoloniality, for here the unequal alliance between the British and the Bhopal diverges the Bhopal to be a superior partner pending colonial decisions. Sikander Begum brings in a resistant facet to the decolonial episteme by creating and dictating precedents. This is a select bibliography, and thank you.
Hi, I'm Delso Batista, a PhD candidate at Nottingham Trent University, and I will present this work on coloniality of power and racism denial, retrospective autoethnographic reflections on the Portuguese higher education. I would like to start from the understanding that the university is not a neutral place, but the iteration of colonialism. This means that in modern history, the last 500 years, the university has been a place of voices erasure and centrality of hegemonic theoretical discourses. Then, Eurocentrism as a paradigm has been taught throughout social sciences disciplines such psychology, sociology, and law, and etc., which in effect historically defined which knowledge, epistemology are valid, relevant, and trustworthy. The modern university is a place where coloniality still echoes. Coloniality of power in higher education refers to the definition of the differences and the dichotomies of power present on people's relationships. Coloniality refers to the codification for differences created by the notion of race that situates inferiority and superiority. However, in higher education, this process seems to function being defined by the specificities of the categories neutral, personal, objective, subjective, master, and servant. These binary logics are central to the understanding which ways oppression and violence is instated in these institutions and are used to keep it as privileged white space. Now, the modern neoliberal Western Portuguese university is also an inescapable stage in which coloniality is reproduced. Studies focusing on the black and brown students' experiences in Portuguese higher education demonstrated that this group is underrepresented in this environment, with 16% of the students being black and brown and more likely to face failure and everyday experiences of racism, discrimination, prejudice, and exclusion. Those are struggles that I faced while studying in the psychology schools in three private and public higher education established institutions in Portugal. This presentation is focused in the reflection to think the impossibilities for racialized students facing while navigating the Portuguese higher education using the method of retrospective autoethnography as a way for radical dreaming and imagination for a new university. I remember back in 2018 receiving an unexpected call from my former supervisor. She, a Portuguese white woman, called me to ask if I was alive, to know if I haven't committed suicide. I was not only surprised by the call, but by the motivation. She said that remembered me after seeing a broadcast telling a story of a young black man who have been targeted by police brutality in Lisbon, and after that he had killed himself. She called me to know if he was I. I also remember that during this first attempt for a PhD, I thought that to be seen and listened was imperative to be able to create evidence based science. I was interested in understanding the connection between masculinity, racism, sexism, and homophobia. During the monitoring meeting with the supervisor and the psychology chair and the independent assessor for my project, two remarks situated an abyss between my ambitions in this study and the Portuguese academia. The first remark was that there is no sense to study race and racism in this context because the black people community is not significant in this country. Second, this kind of study about race and racism should be conducted in places like Brazil, the country where I come from, because yes, there is black people and there is racism in that place, in such places. Therefore, my aspirations disappeared when I get to know that my narrative has been denied. Their positioning in the Portuguese academia allowed them to conclude that there is no such thing as racism in Portugal. According to Quilomba, the Western neoliberal university is a reflection of the white. Then, knowledge is an unquestionable propriety of whiteness. This is a place where our black, queer, indigenous bodies transit is not expected. A place where we cannot arrive or stay as bell hook argued, a place which is structured over denial. Some voices are privileged to be heard and to endure, and others are prohibited and passed over. Navigating in these academic spaces, I got to know what is Eurocentric perspective of knowledge, which is the theoretical base structured during colonialism to justify capitalist exploitation through slavery. Forms of knowledge developed to the naturalization of the continuity of power relations based on domination of Black indigenous people. As a Brazilian person in Portugal, I got to know that I don't speak Portuguese, the language of the colonizer. Instead, my idiom was brasileiro, Brazilian Portuguese. Thus, I spoke something like a broke version of the language, therefore inferior. I remember presenting and delivering a written essay to one of my lecturers of the course, and after that getting a feedback from this white Portuguese lecturer that next time essays must be written in Portuguese. European Portuguese is the language of the colonizer, thus legitimated language to speak, to read, to think in the university. The language recognized at the Portuguese higher education as valid to produce knowledge. I got to know that coloniality in teaching environment is the reiteration of oppression. So, the imposition of power through classification and control, silencing Black indigenous folks, allows the white colonial speech to emerge as universal truth. This is possible through the disqualification of voices defined as deviant. I got to know that coloniality does not accept sharing stage with other voices. Then, who can speak? Liberal democratic discourse would reply to us, daring to dismantle these marginalizing logics, that we can speak, that I'm free to speak. However, I felt everything but freedom after listening to the denial concern my academic work in Portuguese higher education. Again, those oppressive discourses reiterate the denial of race and racism in Portugal. The rationality behind this claim is lusotropicalism, a term coined by a Brazilian sociologist to say that the Portuguese colonialism was less violent and pro-miscegenization, the term that justifies Portuguese coloniality differently than others, the British, the Spanish, because it fosters integration and racial democracy. Lusotropicalism as a myth that denies racism, echoing that still producing those practices and discourses in the Portuguese higher education. My purpose, dialoguing with neoliberal Western university, is still the same, is to seek liberation through knowledge. Liberation as opposition to structural forms of marginalization that are designed to enslave the queer, the migrant, the Black, and others. Structures designed to reinstate new models of enslavement of the other. I'm not reduced to those categories, even though it's clear that the university is a hostile environment that reproduces violence. In its contradiction on operating with knowledge, I do think that we can find gaps to dream another university. Following the proposed methodology of retrospective autoethnography, radical dreaming and hope can be adopted for creating new possibilities of knowledge. The usage of retrospective autoethnography as a methodology allows us to insert ourselves in an utopian future, in a futuristic radical dreaming to create conditions to rewriting and hence re-experiencing the present. As a time machine, retrospective autoethnography supports my imagination to recreate another space for I like to see this environment in the future. A radical humanization. Radical because it seeks liberation through dismantling colonial ways of creating hierarchy, difference, and power over others. And humanization because this future is constructed via dialogue in a constant praxis in a particular context and historical moment. Radical humanization allows us to dream together for a social transformation of oppressive realities and liberated futures. I finished this presentation saying that when we, as a community, work on focusing our imagination for a new university, we are accepting an invitation to dare to dream a liberated and horizontal university for all. Thank you very much.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Sujoy, and I am a postgraduate student of English literature at the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad, India. The title of my presentation today is Language, Science, and Our Modernity, an argument for diversification of the language of science in a post-colonial world. Now, before I begin, I would like to make my purpose clear. What I have prepared today is not something that will explore any hitherto unexplored aspects of our society and culture. It is not a radically new perspective. Instead, what I aim to do is to work within the structure between modernity, science, and language, and thereon try to provide an argument for the development of a proper scientific vocabulary in different native languages of the world. As I believe is evident from the title, my presentation is inspired from Partha Chatterjee's lecture, Our Modernity, that he gave during a lecture tour in Africa in 1996. I would like to begin with a quote from this lecture. Modernity for us is like a supermarket of foreign goods, displayed on the shelves. Pay up and take away what you like. No one there believes that we could be producers of modernity. What he rather provocatively states here is that in a culture that was once colonized precisely under the justification of modernizing the backward natives, the concept inhabits a rather complex position. Reconciliation and assimilation is not possible due to the link with imperialism that is firmly entrenched in colonial history. While on the other hand, production is also complicated because modernity is, in essence, molded in European Enlightenment thought. The once colonizers set up the paradigm of reason and rational thought and diffused them through military and ideological dominance to the point that now, even in our post-colonial world, it has reached the point of being the obvious goal of every culture. Dipesh Chakraborty, in the introduction to his book, Habitations of Modernity, observes the difficulty of characterizing a modernity that is post-colonial and, in his specific context, Indian. The labeling exercise on the part of the left and the liberal intelligentsia has, on the whole, been an attempt to qualify categories characteristic of European metahistories by attaching to them negative particles or prefixes, not bourgeois, not capitalist, not liberal, and so on. These have been our predominant ways of summing up Indian modernity. This focus on the negative implies the struggle to define a post-colonial modernity that is unique to a specific culture. In the same introduction, Chakraborty points out the reason for this problem. It is difficult for social science categories to attain a universality that is completely free of historical and contingent differences between societies. This happens because societies are not tabula rasa. They come with their own plural histories that have already been imbibed by their members through certain shared dispositions, skills, competencies, and sentiments. Thus, the conflict between universal modernity and cultural modernity is at the heart of the problem of self-determination in post-colonial countries. Now, what I mean by cultural modernity here is the obligation to adjust to the legacy of European Enlightenment in lands that are far from Europe in geography and history. Now, before moving to my suggestion of a possible step towards untying this very complicated knot, I would like to briefly explore the relationship between modernity, science, and language. Firstly, modernity and science. How does modernity and science relate to each other? I would like to look at Bruno Latour here and his quite interestingly titled book, published in 1991, We Have Never Been Modern. For Latour, it was not scientific thinking par excellence that fueled modernity, but the construction of the spheres of society and science as separate and autonomous. While on the one hand, society or culture is constructed by and for human beings, science, on the other hand, was thought to be the study of a natural world or natural phenomena that existed outside the domain of the humans. Latour gives us two concepts or practices which for him must remain distinct if they are to be effective: translation and purification. I quote him here: the first set of practices by translation creates mixtures between entirely new types of beings, hybrids of nature and culture. The second, by purification, creates two entirely distinct ontological zones, that of human beings on the one hand, that of non-humans on the other. What this means essentially is that translation is the practice of linking together different instances of scientific issues which are posited in their specific cultural context. For example, translation would be to connect the chemistry of the atmosphere with the physics of a spacecraft, the economy and politics of the country launching the spacecraft, its effect on environment, etc. While purification is the separation of nature and culture, of science and society, to put science in a protective bubble, so to speak, that shields it from the larger social context in the name of progression. For Latour, these two practices are entirely dependent on one another, meaning that there is no point in translation without purification and vice versa. But these two must be allowed to work distinctly as well. That is to say, science should be allowed to work without any inhibition, yet simultaneously constantly be evaluated on its impact on society. This, according to Latour, is a condition for realizing modernity. As the title of the book suggests, this is indeed utopian. So what I want to take from Latour here is the relationship he establishes between science and modernity, and specifically how modernity is always a work in progress, even in European countries where it had originated. Now moving on to the issue of science and language. What exactly is the contribution of language in scientific thinking? For some, language is simply the means of exploring and conveying concepts that relate to the natural truth of the world. But this is a rather dismissive view. Language cannot simply be the means, as it is intrinsically related to our thought. We think in language. Here, I want to look at David Bohm's idea of fragmentation. His idea is quite similar to Latour's separation of science, but Bohm goes deeper. For him, all human work, be it science, politics, art, whatever, is divided into specialties and interdisciplinary subjects which are intended to unite these specialties. They only serve to further separate the fragments. This, in turn, has fragmented each individual human being. That is to say, by separating our knowledge and thoughts of the world into different manageable proportions, we have become fragmented ourselves. For example, into our biology, our psychology, our class, etc. In his book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order, he establishes how language plays a key role in this fragmentation of thought. For Bohm, the subject-verb-object structure of our language places the importance on the subject. That is to say, the subject acts on the object. This is what separates the subject from the object. For example, consider the sentence, he takes the apple. Here, the subject he is performing the action of taking the object, the apple, thereby separating the subject and the object. And the action which links the two here originates from the subject. He is the one who is taking the apple. Now, Bohm expresses, and I quote, "This is a pervasive structure, leading in the whole of life to a function of thought, tending to divide things into separate entities, such entities being conceived of as essentially fixed and static in their nature. When this view is carried to its limit, one arrives at the prevailing scientific worldview, in which everything is regarded as ultimately constituted out of a set of basic particles of fixed nature. What this means basically is that language which we use to express ourselves and formulate our knowledge of the world is itself fragmented and relates to the world by separating it into different entities, subjects and objects. Hence, science has to be fragmented because the language that we use already creates the divide in our understanding. Now, Bohm rejects this fragmentation and insists on the wholeness of things. And to that end, he recommends the Rio mode, which focuses the attention on the verb instead of the subjects and the objects. But that is not currently relevant to my point. What I instead want to take away from Bohm is how language contributes to the fragmentation of science and apply it to Latour's modernity. Latour embraces the fragmentation, or as he calls it, purification, with the caveat that the process of connecting the fragments, that is translation, now this process has to happen simultaneously. So therefore, from Bohm and Latour, if language is one of the fundamental forces behind the fragmentation of science, and if the separation of science is one of the prerequisites of modernity, then I hope I have been able to establish, with some gymnastics of course, how language impacts the realization of modernity. Now this brings us back to the problem of defining post-colonial modernity. Now the subject-verb-object structure, which is the primary reason of fragmentation by language, it may be present in most languages of the world, but it would be quite naive to say that every language performs this action the same way. Societies are distinct, and so are their languages. Take the Bengali word Obhiman, for example. Obhiman resembles something between anger and sadness, but there is no exact equivalent word for Obhiman in English. That is to say, it separates the range of human emotion in a way that is distinct from the English language. So, being able to separate our understanding of the world, or the field of science for that matter, in this way, which is distinct from every other culture, now this can lead to a positive definition of a unique post-colonial modernity, a self-determination based on language and science. Now, this is my argument for the development of a proper scientific vocabulary in the different native languages of the world, which can perform this separation and connection required for realizing modernity. And this is also my suggestion for a step towards reconciling between the modern universal modernity and culture-specific modernity in our post-colonial world. Finally, I would like to highlight two Bengali scientists from the early 20th century who realized the need for practicing science in their native language. First is Jagadish Chandra Bose, a fellow of Royal Society. His most influential work is his invention of the crescograph, with which he recorded plants' reaction to outward stimuli, and subsequently proved the power of feeling in plants. He also has a lot of significant research in the field of radio communication. Now, in the lecture Our Modernity, Partha Chatterjee cites Bose as an example of the attempt to realize a unique Indian modernity in the field of science. To this end, Bose's most significant contribution is the establishment of Bosu Bigyan Mandir, or the Bose Institute, in Kolkata in 1917. It is one of the oldest modern research centers in Asia dedicated to interdisciplinary research. Interesting to note, Bigyan Mandir literally translates to Temple of Science, and the word Mandir is deeply rooted in the religion of Bengali Hindus. Even in the name itself, J.C. Bose's vision of modern science differentiates itself from its Western counterparts. The other person is Satyendranath Bose. He was also a fellow of Royal Society, and he specialized in theoretical physics. His most significant contribution is his collaboration with Einstein to develop the Bose-Einstein statistics and the Bose-Einstein condensate. Paul Dirac named the particle boson after him. For the most part of his career, he was affiliated with the University of Dhaka, which is now in Bangladesh, and he always advocated for educating people in science in their mother tongue, which for him was Bengali. He led the establishment of Bongio Bigyan Porishad, which roughly translates to Science Council of Bengal. This organization is dedicated to research and proliferation of science in the Bengali language. Now, this is the works cited list of my presentation. And before I conclude, I want to very briefly address the issue of accessibility. It is indeed true that if the discourse of science is dominated by few languages, namely English, it is much easier for different scientific communities to communicate among themselves. It is much easier to gather materials and present research output to the world. But as I hope I have been able to show, this comes at a cost of self-determination, and at the cost of creating a paradigm of a modernity that is unique and, echoing the words of Chatterjee, uniquely our. Thank you.
As we move forward into our Q&A section of the event, I would like to thank all of our speakers for such wonderful presentations. Thank you. I thought we could kickstart this session by asking each of our panelists to reflect on the themes of the conference and tell us how their paper works to build or unbuild bridges. So I don't know if someone wants to volunteer to go first.
I think I can start. Thank you very much for this opportunity. For me, thinking about this question and the paper I presented, my idea was to somehow use the colonial research qualitative perspectives, which are reclaiming, storytelling, healing, as a way to discuss my own experience navigating this specific environment, which is the Portuguese higher education. And by naming those experiences, understanding spaces, identities, and counter story, is also a form of creating denouncing of those violences that me and others are being subjected. So my work itself is inspired by dismantling those bridges that keep coloniality inside this universe and university, bridges that keep privilege and hierarchies in the context of higher education, not only in Portugal, but across the globe. But also, I think on the other hand, is a call for creating connections, a sense of community and supportive work that could help us dream collectively for a new university, a place for all, a place where bridges to new possibilities can be designed, and a shift towards a radical humanization. So this is what I think that my work is related to the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, that was really insightful. Shall I volunteer Lee to go next?
Thank you. Yeah. So I think my work is related to the themes of the conference, mainly because I think a lot of the stereotypes around not only to Eastern philosophy but also to non-Western philosophy generally go back to the colonial period. I think that they weren't as strong during, for example, like the 18th century, but I think as the kind of colonial period went on, they became stronger. So it's really trying to challenge a lot of those stereotypes that developed due to colonization. As I said, I think from my research that a lot of Western scholars tended to kind of project back their what they perceive as their cultural intellectual superiority back and thought, oh, we must have always been like this, and they can't ever have had any decent intellectual traditions of their own in the places that they colonized, which obviously I've tried to show is completely false. But my work is also really trying to increase understanding between cultures, essentially, and build bridges, literally and metaphorically, between them. And it's just trying to kind of demonstrate that there's been philosophy all over the globe. All of it's just as sophisticated and as important as any other, and that we need to really make people realize, both within and outside of academia, that non-Western traditions have indeed had philosophy. It's been as sophisticated and as important as Western philosophy, and they deserve as much a place at the table as Western philosophers do. And it's really trying to increase understanding and hopefully tolerance as well, as we make people more aware of that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Lee. I think that's a really important point. I'm going to volunteer Annie to go next.
Definitely. How my research area is related to the theme of the conference, I would say that gender was one of the crucial sites upon which the British tried its colonial modern notions of gender performance. And if you look at the history of the British interactions with different kingship and queenship traditions in colonial India, one could be able to understand that British ardently tried to change kingship traditions by making men the sole transactor and beholder of power. I quote, the colonial state, however, began to recognize only the senior male member as a rightful exerciser of power in the family and created a sexual contract between the state and the men, with the British treating headship as a gendered right available only normatively to men alone. Unquote. This is from Manu's Place, Ivory Thrones. So, in different diverse traditions like Travancore's matrilineal dynasty, where the family constituted of the king and his sister and her son, this kind of British idea of headship kind of created some kind of unprecedented problems, and it is in this context of British creating precedents by normalizing, by including by introducing and officiating the idea of regency as a something in dynasties like Travancore, where regencies never existed. By appreciating regencies, they were also trying to unnaturalize women in power. It is in this context that Sikander becomes president of, creating a political office of Regnancy Begum becomes important. And it is important in another aspect as well, because here Begum was trying to build a bridge with Queenship traditions in Britain and Queenship traditions in Islamic countries in order to normalize women in power. And decoloniality here comes from the fact that, as I mentioned in my paper, Queen Begum, Sikander Begum uses the conventions and the products of Western modernity like roads and bridges to bargain with the British. And hereby, just like the empire writes back using the language, here the Begum uses the material development of her own state to bargain with the British and ask what she wants, that is normalize women in power and to permanently create the office of the regnant Begum in the colonial state of Bhopal. I think that would do for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. That was great. And finally, Sujoy.
Hello. So basically, the term building bridges, there is the name of the conference. It was very interesting to me because I interpreted it to be like building a connection between two sides without losing the identity of each side. And that is where I'd say the essential argument of my presentation comes in. It's like reconciling between what we know to be a universal modernity that was imposed upon like much of the world through Eurocentric colonial practices, and the difficulty in negotiating with this unique concept of universal modernity in the places that those concepts were imposed on. That those places which have like very different history and sometimes violent history with this concept of modernity, those places this modernity becomes very problematic. And to deal with this modernity without losing the specific identity of those places, that is where my argument is essentially that is where we need to practice science in their native languages, because science is in our contemporary era and an integral part of this concept of modernity. So that is where I'd say this whole building bridges and linking together comes in, because I feel we need to take a pluralistic approach regarding the language of science. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That was really great. I think it speaks to the interdisciplinary approach we were trying to achieve. So to kickstart our questions, Beth asks Lee, do you find it hard to work with the broad categories of East and West? Do you ever face critique that suggests the use of these categories feeds into the Orientalist binary? And how do you feel working without these categories without problematizing them? Sorry, that was a few in one.
No, that's a great question. Do I find it problematic working with problems like categories like East and West? I would say yes, because it's so it kind of generalizes a massive, like for example, if I say the East, that's India, China, Vietnam, Japan, etc. Like they're all completely different countries with different cultures, histories, languages, etc. So it does tend to generalize cultures, which is obviously not a good thing in my opinion. I do use it for ease, if anything, not because I completely agree with it. When I say Eastern, obviously even like Eastern philosophy, that encompasses a massive range of different ideas of philosophy. So yeah, what was the rest of the questions? I completely forgot the second part. So I do find it a kind of problem, yeah. And I do think that new categories need to be kind of invented. Like in my paper, I said about Islamic philosophy, for example. Now, a lot of people would class Islamic philosophy as non-Western. I personally, in my own opinion, would classify it as Western, part of Western philosophy, because as I said, in the Middle Ages, especially, Islamic philosophers were using the exact same texts as Europeans. They're using the exact same philosophers as Europeans, and they revered them in the exact same way. Obviously, they had their own spin on it, which should be acknowledged, but I don't think it's enough to kind of categorize them as an entirely different thing. I think it creates a barrier where there's not one, where you don't need one, essentially. And I think obviously you should acknowledge that they were, obviously Muslims, they were Islamic, we should acknowledge that, of course. But I think that if you acknowledge also the connections, intellectual and with trade, etc., between them, it would create a bridge as well. It kind of negates the whole us and them thing. You kind of realize that they were very similar to us, using similar text to us and similar thinkers to us. So it's that. So yeah, I think there is a problem in using it. I think there just needs to be a new category that comes about. I don't think I'm the right person to do that, but hopefully in the near future, that will be addressed. So I hope that answers your question. Hopefully.
I think we can build on your answer with this question from Trang for you and Sujoy. She says, I love that both of you commented on the language in such different ways and from such different perspectives. Could you both talk a little bit more about the role of language in decolonization?
Is this for me, sorry, or for Delso?
That's for Sujoy and you. So I don't know which one of you wants to start.
Oh, okay, Sujoy, you can start if you want. That's fine. Go ahead.
You can start. It's fine. You were talking earlier.
That's fine. I'll just read the question again.
That's okay. I can repeat it.
Yeah, repeat.
Could you both talk a little bit more about the role of language in decolonization?
I guess from a philosophical kind of perspective, I guess the main kind of languages used in philosophy from a kind of colonial perspective were obviously like Latin and Greek and obviously English. I think it would help. So a good one, again, I'm using the example of Islam, but I think that's the best example to use in this particular case. So when we say kind of classical languages, we often say just Latin and Greek. But I think you'd need to add Arabic and Sanskrit to the mix as well, as Chinese as well, because they were used to do philosophy in those contexts at the exact same time. As I said, that was just as sophisticated as Western philosophy. And of course, we need to remember, due to the translation movement in the Middle Ages, it was Arabic-speaking Christians and obviously Muslims and Jews too that actually translated the texts from Greek and other languages into Latin, which then could be used by Western Christians. And if it wasn't for that translation movement, we would have lost a lot of philosophical texts from the ancient world. So obviously, due to that alone, Arabic should be considered one of the classical languages of philosophy. And I think that could be said for, like I said, for Sanskrit and Chinese, and maybe the languages such as Persian as well. So yeah, I think that there does need to be more emphasis on that. That other languages have been used to compose great philosophical works, and I think that could help with decolonization and kind of challenge colonial notions of language superiority as well. So I hope that's kind of helped.
Okay, so about my thoughts, I am not sure how the whole concept of decolonization can actually be achieved in the future, but I do think that, well, since my work based on science, I do think that if we can incorporate different native languages of the world into the mainstream of science practices, then that can be a possible step towards achieving something similar to decolonization and like not mitigating, but rather creating an alternative of the colonial practices and their legacies. So, yeah, like I do think that we have to incorporate more and more native languages of the world, more and more native languages of the world into the mainstream of academia. And it is a complex thing. It is not an easy task. It is definitely a humongous task, rather. But I do think that the cost is too great for us to ignore it. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Perna, and it is for Annie. He asked, could you please reflect a little as to why the Begum/Queen remains as an ignored/underappreciated figure in Indian history?
Thank you for that question. So one of the reasons, that's an interesting question actually, because when I started my research on regent queens, I worked on Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, who herself was a regent queen widely known across the Indian subcontinent. But I myself was not aware of this Begum of Bhopal until my infill research, because one of the reasons being, Indian historiography divides princely states into two categories, black and white categories, as pro-colonial, pro-British, and anti-colonial. And unfortunately, since Begum was loyal to the British during the 1857 revolution and continued to be part of the subsidiary alliance of the entire rule, unfortunately, the presentations of Begum's were not quite negative of her, were not quite dismissive of her, but they conveniently ignored a figure like Begum. And the fact that they were not quite dismissive of the Begum was because of the kind of reforms and developments that she brought into her state, Bhopal. But on the other hand, Indian historiographers and people who are involved in the entertainment industry, like filmmakers or novelists, are quite interested in proclaiming Rani Lakshmibai because of her, apparent allegiance to the 1857 mutineers or rebellious forces in the 1857 revolution, who can be effectively portrayed as anti-colonial icon, as a person who fought against the British. But most often, what we are trying to erase, conveniently ignore here, is that Begum's politics was not anti-colonial. It was an allegiance towards her own state, Bhopal, which, owing to her own political recognition and brilliant statesmanship, survived way into 1947. And the other reason of erasure or underappreciation of this queen is because she belongs to this Muslim minority, which is a minority in India. And the fact that there was this discourse on how there was this golden period for women before the Muslims invaded India, and when the British made it a point to ridicule Indian civilization by pointing out this situation of women, the right-wing Hindu politicians and people argued that it was because of the Muslim group. Appreciating or giving importance to a figure like Begum, who was strong enough to bargain with the British, to assuage the concerns of the ulema and both the British, means that they have to actually renege on the kind of discourse they were trying to, disseminate in the colonial public sphere at that point in time. And besides, I also want to make a point Begum's allegiance was known to a transnational center like the Imperial Britain or Islam for that matter. Her allegiance was to a local center, which we call by the name the princely state of Bhopal. And this center means Begum's transgression of this supposedly global centers like Imperial Britain or Islam means that she was trying to bring in a decolonial politics. So acknowledging multiple centers that are local and regional and intersectional in nature over homogeneous imperial or Islamic center is what defines her decolonial politics. And this is what
We might have lost Annie for a second there, so... Oh, are you back, Annie? I'm sorry, we lost you briefly.
Okay, should I repeat it? Should I repeat it?
I think you're okay. That was a really interesting answer, thank you. Thank you for reflecting on such a rich history. Our next question is for Delso, and it comes from Beth. Beth asks, how do you deal with the paradoxes of decolonizing higher education through the neoliberal Western platforms of academic conferences and scholarship?
Thank you very much for this question. I think this is a huge challenge, and I think the first paradox I see is how some universities or some government institutions trying to use decolonization as part of an agenda for transformation. And I believe that decolonization actually cannot be used as part of any form of agenda. Is more than that. Is actually using this framework, very corporative, is using colonial language, right? So I see that, for example, the endeavors for equality, diversity, and inclusion happening in so many different ambients, including the university, being used as these means to reach decolonization, but don't even touch anti-racist work, don't even touch how we should address the experiences, lived experiences of racialized students, faculty, and so on in these ambience. So is again the reiteration of those forms of violation is not actually aiming towards any form of decolonization. So I think those type of paradox has to be addressed. And the best way, I think the best tradition that decolonization helps with us is through dialogue, is through being able to exchange with others, to be able to listen stories, is to be able to be engaged in conversations in which we can find ways to create reflection, critical consciousness around how coloniality trap us and do not allow us to move forward towards transformation.
Thank you. Your autoethnographic approach was compelling and decolonizing in its own right. What do you think are the benefits and limitations to theorizing your own experiences?
Well, I think that first it's important to know that probably what I did or what we do trying to apply the colonizing framework and methodologies to understand lived experience, but also to understand social and political scenarios are something that historically in social sciences and others has been denied, has been diminished. So it's not uncommon to listen people thinking that looking too much to live the experiences is not being actually creating and help for science. So I think the first question is to think about what exactly is science, and science for who, and science produced by who. And I think those questions are very important to be always part of our work, independent of the field that we are working inside or outside the academia. And I think is relevant more and more to consider that lived experiences, that autobiographic stories are also a way to us to achieve and to have like a grasp and understanding of more broad social cultural problems that people are living in their everyday lives, right? So I know that is challenging. I know that is my read, and this is historically we are read as not being neutral. But I think I have to always put back the question to the field itself, to the scholarship, and what is to be neutral, what is to create knowledge that are impartial and do not acknowledge how our lives are affected by violence in so many different ways, including epistemic violence and so on.
Thank you for that, and thank you for sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Valentina, and it is for Lee. She asked, is your study limited to the origins of philosophy, or do you engage with how the discipline is changing in contemporary times?
Thanks for that question. It's an interesting one. My particular study doesn't focus on the origins of philosophy. I had to do about it to kind of engage with the wider project. I also think it is important to do so because obviously I think in a lot of ways the West considers philosophy as like our thing. It's something that we've given to the world. And in any, as I've kind of made reference to in my presentation, recent scholarship has been shown that that's nonsense. For want of a better word, that's really a misconception. Because although, as I've said, Western philosophy did come from the West, came from Greece. That's not in dispute. But recent scholarship has also shown that philosophy arose in many other places, and that many other places influenced Greece, and vice versa, of course, which is how ideas tend to work. But it's important because I think philosophy is kind of sometimes classed as another kind of colonial kind of thing that we gifted to the world, along with the railways and all the rest of the stuff that we like to kid ourselves with. And we need to kind of challenge that notion because I personally think that philosophy is a thing for all of us, not just a certain section of the world. I think it's designed to help humanity as a whole, and I think it should be kind of construed as a kind of mosaic of human thought in general. And that's why I think world philosophy is so interesting. But so I think philosophy arose in many different places that all influenced each other through trade and war, etc. And I'll come on to that in the answer to another question because it's similar. But so to go and answer your question definitively, my research doesn't just focus on that. I've had to engage with it, but I think it's a very important thing to deconstruct and challenge. And I saw there's a second part to your question, but I don't really understand what you mean by do I consider the role of effect in philosophy? If you'd like to kind of just explain what you mean a little by that and come back, I'll be glad to answer that if we have time. So I hope that's answered your question. Thank you for asking me.
Thank you, Lee. That was very insightful. Our next question is from Sujoy, and it comes from Trent. Trent says, there are also phrases like, we've never been post-human, we've never been individual, we've never been human. Do you think one way to decolonize would be to drop the term modernity altogether, because perhaps there's no such thing as modernity?
That is actually a very interesting take, and thank you for asking that question. And yes, it would be kind of an utopian solution, I think, to completely drop the term modernity. And that would very much be preferable, but I do not think that is possible, because in the popular culture, in the popular consciousness, of course, the term modern very much exists, and it exists with a lot of different meanings behind it, basically. So, and modernity as a concept, it is kind of still the obvious goal, as I said in my presentation, it is the obvious goal of every culture. We all have to be modern. Like like even in the contemporary culture, like non-modern or pre-modern, it is still used as a slang somewhat, and it is used as a derogatory term. So I do not know if there is no such thing as modernity, but like yeah, but okay, let me rephrase that. Um, there is definitely something as modernity, and yes, it would be very much preferable to drop the term modernity completely. And definitely the purpose of interdisciplinary conferences such as these, interdisciplinary discourses such as this, I think should be towards like developing an alternative to modernity. And maybe then we can one day drop the term in our colloquial languages as well. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really good response. Our next question comes from Valentina, and it is for Annie. She asks, you mentioned briefly the topic of victims' interactions and negotiations with Islam. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Thank you, Valentina, for the question. Actually, it's not victim, it's Begum's interactions with Islam. I'm sorry for the pronunciation went wrong. So, to talk about Begum's interactions with the British, the Islam and its modern decolonial politics, I would say that I would start with 1857 revolution. And as I mentioned already in the paper, Begum sided with the British in the 1857 revolution, which was supposedly termed as a Mohammedan conspiracy by the British after the revolution. Her own mother, Qudsiya Begum, and the ulema wanted her to support Bahadur Shah Zafar and the armed rebellion, which goes by the name Sujoy.
Oh, I think we've lost her again.
He lost me again. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I was telling you, against the wishes of the ulema, in which her own sovereignty gets its legitimacy and authority, and opposing her own mother's advice to side with the rebelling mutineers, she sided with the British. And this was an act which was considered heretic by the Muslim community back then, because Bhopal was a Muslim state. So, in order to speak about her decolonial politics and her interactions with Islam, I have to actually talk about the travel she undertook, the pilgrimage she undertook to Mecca, and the implication of such a travel. Usually, Muslim chieftains and from chieftains to that of the emperor of a Mughal dynasty never undertook the journey themselves because of the dangerous nature of the travel and the lengthy nature of the travel, because no such easy way of transportation was available back then. So it was always the women of the dynasties, women of these Muslim states who undertook this holy pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. And after the revolution in 1860, being the regnant Begum of Bhopal, she decided to undertake this journey herself, not as one of the female members of the dynasty, but as a sovereign of a Muslim state, as a regnant Begum of the Muslim state. And this was an action which was undertaken to assuage the concerns of her Muslim subject that she's still a devout Muslim. And she has written a travelogue after this pilgrimage she undertook, and it's a brilliant travelogue. But in this travelogue, we never get to know what happened in Mecca, what is her experience doing this once in a lifetime opportunity. Instead, we find more than 20 letters where she actually complains to the Sharif and Pasha of Medina and Mecca that this is not how you should actually treat a sovereign from India who is also a British subject. She's actually trying to transact her sovereignty here and not her Muslim piety. And in that way, she's also actually talking back to her Muslim subject how powerful she is in a Muslim heartland, and how important she is, because she actually actually took a wise decision in the 1857 revolution. You have a strong sovereign here because I took an important decision. And she also makes it a point to actually invoke the reformed and developed Bhopal by comparing to the abject conditions Arab heartland is going through. There is no drainage, there is mucking all over, and there is all kinds of things that you associate with an Orient land with. And she compares. She doesn't compare with Bhopal, but she invokes the image of Bhopal through the image of the Arab heartland she is explaining there. So what I'm trying to say here is that she's actually, as I mentioned earlier, she's trying to transgress this global centers like the imperial Britain or imperial power or the Islamic power, and trying to actually relocate the narrative back to her regional or local center, which is her princely state of Bhopal, from which she got her power and she continued to hold power. And this kind of an activity, this kind of acknowledging of multiple centers, which are local, regional, and intersectional in nature, over homogeneous imperial or Islamic center is what defines her decolonial politics and paramodern politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. And thank you for making the effort to speak to us today when we know you have very bad storms in your area at the moment. We really appreciate your time. Our next question is for Delso, and it comes from Trang. Trang says, thanks so much for your insightful presentation. Do you consider language itself to be a way of disrupting colonial power? For example, using Brazilian Portuguese to disrupt from within Portuguese as a colonial language?
That's an amazing question. And I think I will also connect off the responses with Lee and Sujoy before concerning language. For me, the role of language is critical in the colonial work. So, for example, who can speak and what can be said, for example, is argued by the colonial authors that is highly surveilled by coloniality historically. And thinking in this context of the university, we historically know that when a racialized person talk, usually that person is categorized as talking in a personal or unscientific way, more than scientific or universal. It seems that when we talk, when we racialized people talk, these do not come in a frequency that can be heard by universalism, centrality, and mostly whiteness. So language, in my understanding, is fundamental to help us achieve liberation and emancipation from those prescriptions of coloniality, oppressing people's life in an everyday life. And language is a living thing, right? So this provides us humans the capacity of telling our stories and creating universes and creating futures. So denying the existence of in the singularity of, in a way of speak, like the Brazilian Portuguese in comparison to the European Portuguese, which is a colonial language, is a form of reiterating racism. The recognition of our story being told using our language can be used to disrupt universalism, Eurocentrism, and centrality. And for me, is a significant form to deal with coloniality. So art, music, poetry, beyond academic work, can be used as forms of expression that can be used in that goal to dismantle those forms of oppression. So currently, we can find a lot of activities, work being published in this sense. Like in Portugal, we can find authors getting together to publish their poetry and to tell their own lived experiences in a way that they expressing themselves using Brazilian Portuguese, for example, but all other variants of Portuguese used in former colonies of Portuguese empire in Africa. So yes, I think that's a brilliant way that we can find and share together to dismantle these colonialities.
Thank you for that. And I think it was really lovely how you picked up on how these papers can speak to each other. Our next question is from Perna, and it comes for Lee. He says, can you please speak a little about why Buddhism as a philosophical practice appealed to the masses across the Indian subcontinent and beyond, and about the contemporary worldwide Marxization of mindfulness and yoga practices connected with Buddhism?
Yeah, of course. So thank you, Brendan. This is a really interesting question, actually. So to avoid giving everyone a massive historical lecture, I've just wrote down a few points to address the first part of your question. I do know quite a lot bit about the history of Buddhism, so I feel I can answer it. So from what I've obviously researched from other scholars who probably know more than me, to answer the first part of your question, I think it appealed for a number of reasons. I think one of the main ones is that it didn't rely on the caste system. I will use the term Indians in this context to refer to people from what is now Bangladesh and Pakistan too, for ease of reference. I'm sorry about that. I think it appealed to people because it didn't rely on caste. So anyone from any part of the caste system could convert to Buddhism. The Buddha kind of challenged caste distinctions. It also allowed foreigners to convert to it. So, for example, when Alexander the Great invaded what's now North India and Pakistan, Punjab, we know that there is evidence that Greeks converted to Buddhism because obviously they were free of they didn't have to apply to within the caste system. So that is one of the main reasons. Another one I think is that it appealed to women as well. There are a couple of poems that we have from women from the kind of early times of Buddhism who became nuns, and this lady, I think her name was Sungalamata, she kind of implies in this poem that she became a Buddhist nun to escape an abusive relationship, and it's quite nice actually. She kind of says how it's freed, it's liberated her, she can seek her own path, etc. So it's quite nice. So that's another big reason. Another one is that it was portable. The kind of what became Hinduism at the time relied on sacrifices, being stationary, etc. Buddhism could be kind of, it could be a religion that was kind of, easily kind of movable and portable. It could be used for trade. A lot of Buddhism spread throughout India and beyond through the Silk Roads, the trade routes stretching from what's now Rome to China. Buddhism spread a lot that way because it was portable and it didn't require you to be in a stationary place to practice it. Another easy one is that the message of Buddhism, I think the same as other religions like Christianity, etc., appealed to people. It obviously preaches freedom from dukkha, which means kind of in English suffering, and that obviously appealed to people. It was a very unstable time when Buddhism arose. There were frequent wars, etc. It appealed to people to see that there was a way out of suffering, etc. And lastly, I think a major historical reason is the conversion of the Emperor Ashoka. For those who don't know, Ashoka was an emperor of the Mauryan Empire who converted to Buddhism in kind of the same way as Constantine converted to Christianity in the West. The story, in very brief, says that he tried to basically conquer a place called Kalinga in the south of India, and after he conquered, he saw the suffering that he'd caused and the people that he'd killed, and he converted to Buddhism because of that, and he kind of really revolutionized India in that way. He spread Buddhism a lot. He made deforestation, animal sacrifice illegal, and he's quite a famous emperor. But anyway, I think his conversion to Buddhism spread. He sent missionaries to a lot of places like Sri Lanka, other parts of India, even the Greek speaking parts of India that I mentioned earlier from Alexander's conquests. That spread it a lot too. So obviously, there are more reasons, but I think they're the main kind of ones why it appealed to so many people. To quickly address the second part of your question about yoga and mindfulness, obviously yoga is a kind that, as we see it in the West, a kind of a stripped down version of Hindu practice, and yoga obviously is quite a few thousand years old from the evidence that we have, and mindfulness is kind of a stripped down version of Buddhist meditation. I think it appeals to people in the West who want to seek a kind of alternative to mainstream religion, the whole spiritual but not religious thing. I think personally that's a misconception of Buddhism. I think that you can classify it, in my personal opinion, as both a religion and a philosophy, because there's not that much of a separation in India itself and in other Eastern countries between religion and philosophy like there is in the West. But I think it appeals to people because they see it as, like I said, an alternative to mainstream religion, but I don't really think that it is, but that's how people see it. And I think, I just guess the whole message of kind of calming yourself appeals to people in the West, the same way Stoicism, which is an ancient Greco-Roman philosophy, is starting to make a comeback now as well. There are loads of books, How to be a Stoic, etc., and it's kind of seen as like a Western alternative to Buddhism. I think that appeals for the same reasons. I think people are feeling a lot of anxiety and stress at the moment due to recent events, etc., modern life. I think that's why it appeals to people. It's a kind of calming alternative to other traditions, and I think it helps people navigate the world we're living in today. I think that's a lot of the reason why. So obviously, I don't take too much time. I hope that's helped answer your question, and thank you for asking me.
Thank you for your insights, Lee. That was really interesting. We are quickly running out of time, so for our final question, we have a question for Sujoy from Valentina. She says, thank you. Would you say that untranslatability plays a crucial role for the resistance and in articulating a post-colonial modernity?
Thank you for the question. And yes, I definitely do agree that the essential differences between different languages, they can and they definitely play a essential role into forming their own identity, forming the identity of the culture, specifically in a post-colonial world. But I do want to focus on the point of untranslatability. And science, as we know, it should not, I do not believe that science should be hindered with the problem of untranslatability. And yes, it is necessarily a complicated, it will be a complicated process. The translation perhaps is not possible, but I do think that we should focus on those specific points of untranslation or untranslatability, and try to like make more sense of it, like try to properly create the bridges, the building bridges that we are trying to work towards. Untranslatability is a hindrance to that, and while there are definitely advantages using native languages, because there are specific and separate understanding of nature and culture in the different languages of the world. Untranslatability as the concept, I do believe we should work towards dismantling it, and maybe we could uh, focus on dedicated science translators, those people whose sole job should be to connect the different scientific concepts between different languages. And yes, and maybe that way we can move towards a more, if I may use the word, egalitarian future. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was a really nice way to wrap up our conversation today. So I'm afraid that is all we have time for today. I want to say thank you again to our wonderful panel for your amazing presentation and engaging answers. Please join us again tomorrow at 11:15 a.m. for a reading by author Leonie Ross of her new novel, This One Sky, and a discussion about her writing process and decolonization. Thank you.